It's a real pleasure again for me to be back on the podium. And I have sort of mixed feelings about seeing so many people in the room. It's really nice to see you all here on a Saturday morning, but I thought after my talk yesterday you would all be out running in the marathon. You did it already? Okay. All right. So what we're going to talk about are the determinants of peak skeletal mass. We're going to talk about bone mass and its control in premenopausal years. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the interpretation of bone density in young women, and then briefly talk about the intercurrent problems that cause loss of bone density and fractures in young women. So this is what we all think of as the skeleton, the growth of the skeleton. Now, look at that very carefully, because I'm going to come back to this as an issue. The person on the left has the lowest bone density of any of that group. The T-score for that little baby is probably about -5. And that's something we don't commonly recognize when we're talking about bone density. Bone density is very heavily dependent on body size. And so peak bone density occurs somewhere between the ages of 18 and 35, and then it's all downhill from there. Only for the skeleton. Only for the skeleton. Bone loss occurs earlier in women than it does in men, but it occurs universally in most people as they age. And one of the reasons that does that is that we become lazier and lazier as we get older. I went into this a little bit yesterday, but it's incredibly important. If you watch me during a talk, you see that I walk up and down. And as I walk up and down, I bounce up and down on my heels. I'm exercising. Exercise is not difficult. Exercise can be fitted in your life all day, any day. What is important is the rate of bone remodeling. And if you remodel within a certain physiological window, which is what happens in premenopausal women, then your bones will be healthy. If there is too little turnover, as it happens in some congenital diseases, then you get aged bone, old bone, unrepaired microcracks, hypermineralization, and an increased likelihood of fracturing, even though bone density might be high. If you have too much turnover, you lose bone mass. Because in general, except in estrogen-replete states, increased bone remodeling leads to more loss and less new bone being formed. The consequence is osteoporosis. And it is the loss of bone tissue that leads to osteoporosis. So let's talk about what determines peak skeletal mass. It's in your genes. Simple as that. 80% of the skeletal mass is determined by your parents. If you're born to big parents, the likelihood is you'll be big and you will have a big skeleton, you will have high bone mass. If your mother is 5 foot and 100 pounds dripping wet, and your father is 5 foot 1 and 102 pounds dripping wet, you will have a small skeleton and you will have low bone mass. Nothing wrong with you, just low bone mass. And I'm going to keep coming back to that as an issue. As of 2009, there were 241 SNPs that have been suggested as being important in obtaining or creating bone mass. Most of those were related to configuration of body size. The genes that control body size also control skeletal size. But also in there were signals within the Wnt pathway. That is the pathway that's predominant in the control of bone formation. And in the right ligand pathway, that's predominant in the role of bone resorption. So bone turnover becomes an intrinsic part of how well your skeleton is behaving. There are unusual situations. This was the first phenotype that was shown from Creighton University, a family with high bone mass. Nothing wrong with them except they had high bone mass, and what happened was that one of the family got x-rayed and the radiologist said, bones look awfully dense, so they got bone density done. And these people were 5 standard deviations above the average value. Nothing wrong with them, they just had a high bone, a gene that allowed them to develop a high bone mass. So bone mass reaches a peak somewhere between, I put down here 18 and 25, but it's probably 18 to 35, and it's very dependent on which part of the skeleton you look at. Genetics are important, but Then there's everything else. That last 20 to 25% of skeletal maturity is very dependent on a variety of factors that include endocrine factors, nutritional factors, and physical activity factors. Endocrine factors are important. The age at which you go through menarche is important. The earlier menarche occurs, the more likely it is your skeleton will not fully develop. Use of birth control in premenopausal women, as I'll show you. Altered menstrual status becomes incredibly important for young women. And altered levels of testosterone, because testosterone is one of the precursors of estradiol. And that's where, in men, that becomes incredibly important. So, load-bearing activity, physical activity, helps increase bone mass. That happens in childhood, it happens in adults, and it happens almost irrespective of the exercise that you do. A lot of stuff is said about load-bearing. Load-bearing is important, it's important when you're growing, but in reality, physical activity is so important as we get older that it doesn't really matter what you do, as long as you do something. Then, the next thing that we have to consider is body composition. Body composition is primarily related to our nutritional status as well as our physical activity. We talk a lot about calcium and vitamin D related to bone, but in the growing skeleton, protein is at least as important, as are some of the minor elements like magnesium. Some people will talk about boron, silicon, and so on. But in reality, if you've got a diet that is good in protein, good in calcium, good in vitamin D, you'll create a normal skeleton. That starts early, really early. And I'll show you one of the outcomes of that in a minute. But in utero, nutrition is incredibly important. And it sort of saddens me to realize that in the United States, even yet, gynecologists and obstetricians will fail to tell women that getting an adequate amount of calcium and vitamin D is critical in the growth of the skeleton of their child. Why is that? As you'll see, the baby in utero is a parasite and will take everything it can to grow. Physical activity is an interesting issue for the growing skeleton because the effects through growth can be maintained right into adulthood. Relatively high protein intakes seem to improve bone growth in young adults. But there are conflicting publications about that, in part because they failed to determine what the source of the protein is. Animal protein, red meats, tend to be acidic, and acidic proteins tend to increase bone removal, bone resorption. And so non-acidic proteins tend to be more beneficial to the skeleton as we grow up than acidic ones do. So we generally tell people, get a reasonable amount of protein from your diet, try to get it from dairy produce, grains, and so on, and get about 1 to 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. It's a nice little way of looking at it. But here's where it all gets down to the reality and the image of data. This slide says that if you eat fruits and vegetables, your bone density will be better. I don't know whether that's the case or not. All I know is that this slide is what it is. It's a study where higher intakes of fruits and vegetables were associated with better skeletal status. Let me tell you what I think it says. What I think it says is that people who eat good diets have better bones. And it just happens to be mirrored here in fruits and vegetables. I think it's all to do with eating a good all-round diet. Because this is what happens, and you all know this better than I do. This is what happens to milk intake as we get up, and carbonated drinks, which are in squares. Milk is diamonds. We stop taking things that we're eating or drinking things that are good for us, and we start eating and drinking things that are not very good for us. And it's very clear that many of the sodas that are on the market are bad, both from the point of view of the sugar content, but also from the point of view of the phosphate content, and the fact that those also are somewhat acidic. But we do it. And if you look at it carefully, then you can see metabolic changes that occur as a consequence of that. Here we're looking at milk and cola, milk and cola, milk and cola. We're looking at parathyroid hormone levels, osteocalcin levels, which is a marker for bone formation. And then CTX, or cetalopeptide, which we talked about yesterday, is a marker for bone resorption, as is NTX. And what this slide shows is that as you change from milk intake to cola intake or soda intake, then you have greater effects on calcium homeostasis. Your parathyroid hormone level goes up, your bone remodeling level goes up, and the likelihood is that in the long term, that will not be particularly beneficial for either the growing skeleton or the skeleton in the young adult. So here we are looking at adolescent girls and looking at bone density as a function of milk intake. I'm a huge proponent of milk intake. Milk went through a very bad phase, and I should say that the Dairy Council paid me no money to say this. Milk went through a very bad phase when it was associated with hypercholesterolemia. But in fact, milk is a very good source of protein and calcium. Not such a good source of vitamin D, it's very variable in its vitamin D content, but it's a very good source of protein and calcium. And that's shown here, where the higher intakes of milk are associated with better bone density. And I could do the same for all non-red meat sources of protein. I belabored a little bit yesterday vitamin D. I'm going to belabor it again. 50% of the people that I see clinically are vitamin D insufficient. Why? Nobody goes out in the sun because the dermatologists have scared us all from sunlight. And if we do go out in the sun, we put on SPF 50. And if you have SPF 50 on your skin, you do not synthesize cholecalciferol in your skin. So I will go back to what I said yesterday. Please, everybody in the room, take some vitamin D. It will do you no harm, it will do you a lot of good. As I said, go to Costco, you'll buy a year's supply of vitamin D for $10. I'm a great fan of Costco too, as well as Here are the changes in diet that relate to bone density. And they're all statistically significant. In other words, the conglomerate of our diet is what is important in maintaining our skeleton. Not any individual piece of our diet, but as a conglomerate of our diet. Well, let me return now to physical activity. The thing that upsets me about physical activity and its importance in the skeleton is that when budgets are tight, schools cut back on physical activity. I think that is a disgrace. I think physical activity should probably be the last thing we get rid of. I have a 15-year-old daughter who thinks that I'm crazy about vitamin D, and so she did a study in her class looking at vitamin D intake, and she discovered that the average intake in her class of 10th graders was 200 units of vitamin D a day. And then she said, well, maybe they get it from the sun. And so she assessed their exposure to the sun over the course of a summer, when you think everybody would be out playing. She found out that nobody was out playing. They were all at home playing on computer games. And they got no sunlight. Now she's trying to get the school district to allow her to draw blood on those to determine. And getting a school district to do that is harder than getting... The physical activity things that we do during childhood are actually important because they continue into old age. And here you see a result from a paper published in the Journal of Bone and Mineral Research just this month, looking at gymnasts. Average at age 11, when gymnasts are really stretching to try and get into national competition, they had better bone. And at 25, when they had been retired for 6 to 14 years, they still had about 20% greater bone mass. Physical activity during growth is really important. That's shown again here, looking at the intertwine of diet and exercise. The diet here is just looking at calcium. But again, people who do both have a good diet and exercise have better skeletons. Same is true here. These are data actually taken from a group of people at West Point, our data. And we were asked by the Department of Defense to determine why it is that girls at West Point have a high incidence of stress fracture. Paid us a lot of money to do that. And we showed some interesting relationships, like diet and exercise are important. But But after spending a lot of the Department of Defence's money, we figured it out. If you are a woman and somebody puts a 50-pound bag in your bag, puts boots in your feet and marches you for 50 miles a day, you're going to get stress fractures. Right. It's sort of like buying toilet seats for the Pentagon. Spend a lot of money and you come out with a conclusion that we knew when we went into that. The next thing that's important is going through an adequate menarche, good menstrual function. And the later menses start, the better in general. And once they start, the more regular they are, the better. People with irregular menses are inadequately estrogenized. That's looking at here with less than 9 cycles per year, more than 10 cycles per year. And no matter which skeletal site you measure, bone density is always a little better. So how do we get around that? Well, there are several ways of getting around it. One is to get rid of periods all the time. And of course, the classic disease that occurs in is anorexia nervosa. Anorexia nervosa is a disaster. It's a disaster because it's life-threatening, but it's also a disaster for the skeleton, and a lot of people don't think about that. The worst bone disease I have ever seen was in an 18-year-old ballet dancer who had been anorectic since the age of 11 because her ballet master wanted her to be pre-menarchal body shape, body image. When I saw her, she had 3 vertebral fractures and she had just broken her tibia at 18. If I was able to cure one thing in young women, it would be to cure anorexia nervosa. Same is true of the athlete's triad. Combination of pure nutrition, excessive exercise, and amenorrhea. That's equally bad for the skeleton. It used to be much more common than it is. It was common in runners, it was common because coaches wanted more and more and more activity. And they didn't think about cross-training. The only time in my life that I've actually been sued was sued by a college coach when I told him publicly that what he was doing was killing his kids. The suit went nowhere. The judge agreed he was killing his kids. You worry about this in young women who have recurrent stress fractures. The first thing you have to ask is a dietary history. And they will lie. They'll not tell you the truth. They don't want to uncover. It's very difficult to treat. What about men? Well, okay, they're anorectic and they're amenorrhea. Well, let's put them on a pill. Not such a good idea in teenage girls. Putting teenage girls on the pill tends to restrain the growth of the skeleton. That's again shown in this study. Looking at bone mass again across a whole bunch of skeletal sites and showing that the people on the pill as teenagers tend to have less bone than people who are not on the pill. Once you get past the teenage years, though, it's actually good. There's pretty good evidence that contraception in fully mature adults has no effect on the skeleton until you get into the late 30s and 40s, when bone loss is beginning to start to happen because you're becoming perimenopausal. And in that stage, oral contraception stops the early bone loss. So between 20 and 40, it really doesn't change very much, and after 40, we retard the pre- and postmenopausal acceleration of bone loss. But one form of contraception is critical to the skeleton, and that is the use of depo-hydroxyprogesterone acetate. Why it is that there are now recommendations on the term limits of use of that, particularly in young women. You will lose bone if you're on DEPA-MPA because your pituitary ovarian cycle shuts down and you become estrogen deficient. Very simple. During that period of time, you will lose bone. If that period of time is less than 6 months to a year, you will regain that bone. You will remake it again. But if you're on DEPA-MPA for a long period of time, that bone loss will become irreversible. And it's sort of peculiar because if you look at the more androgenic steroids, like norethisterone, norgestrel, and even oral NPU, it's not particularly androgenic, then there doesn't seem to be a huge effect on the skeleton, and there may be positive effects of norethisterone. All right, let me turn to one other issue, pregnancy. I sort of said this earlier, that the fetus is a little bit of a parasite. This is what happens during pregnancy in people who are not sort of adequately protected, if you like. What you're looking at here is the change in bone resorption on the left, measured as deoxyribonucleic, and bone formation on the right, measured as bone alkaline phosphatase during the course of pregnancy. They both increase. Bone remodeling goes up. Right? Bone remodeling goes up. That's the baby getting what it needs. Very simple. Baby wants calcium for its skeleton, particularly in the third trimester. It's going to take it. It takes it from the mother. So the mother has to have an adequate amount of calcium and an adequate amount of vitamin D. I sort of look at it this way. I used this graph yesterday for something different, but now I'm going to use it for metabolically driven bone remodeling. That's the excess. That's what causes bone loss. That's what causes bone loss during pregnancy if you're not adequately protected. You don't really need all of that. Bone remodeling should be set at a much lower rate. Now let's turn to normal, healthy young women and the interpretation of bone density in that group. Bone density is really just measuring the absorption or deflection of X-rays by the perceived area of tissue. It's not even a density. It doesn't measure density. It measures grams per square centimeter, sometimes called the areal density, which is a term that I really don't understand. Consequently, because it's not really measuring a density, small people with small bones will have low bone density. In healthy premenopausal women, there's a range of bone density. And the range is really the average plus or minus 2.5 standard deviations. That's the T-score. If you have comorbidities, then you might be outside that range. But if you fall within that range, you're normal. Bone densities get reported if the T-score is below -1 as having osteopenia. Osteopenia is a classically derived polysyllabic noun, and people think it's a disease. It's not a disease. If you're 5 foot 1 inches tall, do you have inchopenia? I'm glad this is a female audience, because the male audience would have looked at me like... It is silly to take people in the bottom half of the range and call them abnormal. It means they are likely to be small and slim, and it's good to be small and slim. Nothing wrong with that. So don't call them something abnormal. Get rid of that term. It becomes important in postmenopausal women, as we talked a little bit about yesterday, but not in premenopausal women. So what about doing bone density in premenopausal women? Don't. Don't. If you've got a healthy premenopausal woman, do not measure bone density, because if she gets a T-score of -1.5, she's going to be really worried because she's got dreaded osteopenia. Do not do it. It is useful when you've got other problems going on. People with anorexia, multiple sclerosis, steroid treatment, they might benefit from measurement of the skeleton, might benefit from intervention, but otherwise don't use it. The other situation where we use bone density is people with unexplained fractures. Worth doing it then. If trauma was relatively minimal, then it's worth looking at. And this goes back to what I showed yesterday. Thanks for sending Mrs. Smith for bone density evaluation. Her T-score is -2, increases her fracture risk by 4 times. But she's 5 foot and 100 pounds. That's where the T-score should be. There's nothing wrong with her. Right? But if she's 5 foot 10 and 200 pounds, there is something wrong with her. That's not where her bone density should be. She's got big bones. Right? And what if she's 70 years old? The message I gave yesterday again, bone density has to be interpreted in the light of the person who's sitting in the office with you. Bone density should not be interpreted by radiologists who have no idea who the bone density was done on. It has to be interpreted by the clinicians, healthcare professionals who actually know and see the patient. Because this is what you're trying to avoid. If you go down to the Smithsonian, you'll see those up in the wall in the Air and Space Museum. This is normal bone on the left from our group, and abnormal bone osteoporosis. That's what you're trying to avoid. You can have normal bone and have a T-score of -2.4 if you're 5 foot and 100 pounds. You cannot have normal bone and a T-score of -2.4 if you are 200 pounds. Or if you're 70 years of age. If you're 70 years of age and you have a T-score of -2.4, you will have the bone on the right, the abnormal bone. Interpretation of bone density is very dependent on the person who's there with you. The problem is an architectural one. It's not a density one. We change the architecture and we lose bone, and consequently we get osteoporosis. And that's really what this slide says. It's the architectural aspects of it that are important. So what about the comorbidities that we might worry about? Any chronic disease that interferes with activity, nutrition, or ovarian function can affect the skeleton. That's when you start worrying about doing bone density. The classic example, of course, is anorexia. There are also a whole bunch of drugs that affect the skeleton. These range from steroid, SSRIs, the glitazones used for diabetes, aromatase inhibitors, as you hear about later, gonadotropin agonists, chemotherapeutic agents, and the list goes on and on and on. It's so long now because the FDA almost requires a bone study on every drug that's coming out. A lot of drugs affect. So how do PPIs affect the skeleton? Well, most people supplement their intake with calcium. What calcium do they take? They take calcium carbonate. What does calcium carbonate need for dissolution? Acid. You're on PPI not making acid, it's tough to absorb calcium carbonate. So you're actually limiting the calcium intake by being on PPI. You can go down the list of those and figure out whether or not. So what is the recommendation? Physical activity, keep doing it. As I said earlier, I used to spend a lot of time sending people to the gym. Send them to the gym, they leave me full of vim and vigor. They go to the gym, they sign up, they write the check, and you never go back. And it took me a long time to learn that writing a check isn't exercising. So now I tell people, find something you like to do. You don't have to do it for a while. How many miles have I walked during this lecture? Right? I'm exercising. Go back to that. It's easy to do. Eat a good diet. Modest amounts of red meat because it's an acid load, but high in fruits and vegetables. Standard stuff. Try to get 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams of calcium, preferably from diet. That's the way our body is used to seeing nutrients. It's not used to seeing nutrients as pills. So total intake. If you need to look at calcium intake, what I said yesterday is the same. Go to the National Osteoporosis Foundation website, NOF.org, and there's a calcium calculator there. You can go below 1,000 milligrams on some days, you can go above 1,500 milligrams on some days, but the average should be somewhere in there. Supplement vitamin D. Every day is vitamin D insufficient as far as I'm concerned. Avoid cigarettes and keep alcohol intake modest. Of course, where I come from, modest is different than it is in the United States. So, just to wrap up, please try and avoid the utility of using bone density measurements in young people. By and large, young people don't need them. Young women are protected from skeletal disease by their ovarian function. And as long as they're healthy, as long as their diets are good, as long as they're physically active, and as long as they're having regular periods, they're fine. And please, don't ever tell somebody they've got osteopenia. Big long words are bad. We use them in medicine to hide behind something we don't understand. That's true here. And then, next thing then is, please don't use osteoporosis medicines in young people unless you can really substantiate the fact that they've got idiopathic osteoporosis. I love the phrase, the term idiopathic. Basically, it means the patient is pathetic and the doctor is an idiot. It means we haven't found out what the cause is. Right? So idiopathic osteoporosis is something you can use medicines for, but other than that, try not to use it. If fractures are present, then evaluation is appropriate. Intervention may be appropriate in that setting, but that occurs relatively unusually. With that, I'm going to stop. Thank you all for your attention once again. This is the point at which you can take me on. You're free rein. Yes.
I milk and getting calcium from your diet. I've heard many other people talk about milk as worse than grain alcohol for your diet and for you, and I'd just be interested what your thoughts are about it. Obviously, you like it.
Let's face it. When you are born, what is your first source of food?
Yeah, but we're adults.
Should that change things? I think there is a lot of argument. If you have a lipid problem, then there's a lot of argument for not taking whole milk. But you can get low-fat milk. And it's good. You can get soy-based milk. There are a lot of milk products that will give you an adequate amount of calcium in your diet. If you can't get it from that, every green leafy vegetable has got calcium in it. The only one that's got calcium in it you can't absorb is from spinach. But even George Bush, who hated broccoli, could get enough calcium in his diet. So it's dead easy to get calcium from a diet. It's not so easy to get vitamin D from a diet. And stay off alcohol.
I have a question about all of the use of antidepressants. I'm over here.
Oh, thank you.
Which is maybe up to even 45% of my patients on some sort of serotonin, and I know that there's some impact on bone and loss of bone, and some of the psychiatrists say is it depression or is it really the drug? Any thoughts?
That's a very good question, and I really don't know the answer to that question. Is it depression or is it the drug? And there is no doubt that people who are depressed, go out in the sunlight, don't eat properly, and are likely